Okay, welcome everyone. Let me know if you have any trouble hearing. There are no microphones in this room, but it's a small room. And we have some more chairs up a little bit closer at the table, if anyone would like to move up. I think there's been a little bit of confusion about the room because we were originally told by the CSO staff that it would be in the MC building, but it's over here now, so we may have some people coming and going. In any case, I'm very glad you've come. I'm Sarah Burke. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung's IMF UN World Bank Liaison Office based in New York. I'm very excited that we have an amazing set of people in our panel. This discussion about how to make external debt sustainable, about defining what sustainability is a critical question, not only here in the Washington-based institutions, but also in the UN in discussions about the next set of development goals. So we know that this discussion is not it's not merely a technical discussion, but it's primarily a political one. So I'm hoping that we will have people whose depth in this is so rich that you'll be able to ask and have conversations with them on both a technical and a political level, and I encourage you to do so. I will pass off to our wonderful moderator, Eric Lecomte from Jubilee USA, and thank you all again for coming.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. And I think we really owe a special debt of gratitude to Sarah and the team at Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for their organizational role in making this event happen and pulling together this conversation. Also, our colleagues at Jubilee Germany have kind of been our partners in debt crime for the past many years. And it's great to be able to do this event with them as this event is dealing with the major theme that's ahead of the International Monetary Fund in this very moment. We're incredibly excited about the panelists who are here. And before I introduce the panelists and share a little bit about what they're speaking about, it's important to mention, what our motivation is for having this conversation. Jubilee USA Network is a religious coalition that also includes groups as vast as the AFL-CIO, and we're pleased that many of our members are here with us today. Our focus on these issues and international financial institutions stems from the reality that we want to stem and challenge extreme poverty in the world. Right now, 1 out of 5 people in the world are living in extreme poverty. We're coming out of a financial crisis that had its root causes significantly in unsustainable debts as well as speculative investment. And right now, the conversation that's taking place here today is the conversation that's taking place throughout the International Monetary Fund. How can we be prepared when the next financial crisis comes? We've been seeing regional or global financial crises essentially happening around the world every 11 to 13 years. And with that in mind, we're probably about 10 years out from the next one. Are we prepared? And although this week there was a very great report that came out from the International Monetary Fund on the world economic outlook, it's clear that although there has been some recovery, inequality still persists, and it's also clear that out of the financial crisis, more people have been added to the ranks of extreme poverty and have not moved out since the financial crisis. So that's the lens that we come at today's event, and that we bring the high-profile speakers together to have this conversation. More than one of the speakers talked to me before the meeting, and they said, Eric, I want to share some controversial things. So I think this is going to be a very exciting conversation based on what some of these speakers will offer. The current context and the current moment we're in terms of looking at these debt sustainability issues and these frameworks, is really trying to come up with a very clear definition of how we rank countries in terms of their ability to progress, or how we rank countries that are trapped in poverty. That's the underlying foundation. And over the last year, there's been an active conversation in the G20 and the International Monetary Fund about these issues. In fact, one of the issues that will be discussed today, aspects or the actual process of an international bankruptcy mechanism for countries, is something that has been discussed at the highest level of the G20 over the last year. And the G20 on both debt sustainability as well as this process has invited the International Monetary Fund to do further exploration. Last April, there was an important paper that came out from the International Monetary Fund that talked about how an international bankruptcy process or aspects of this process might be able to work or succeed. Since that moment, there have been several very influential conversations as well as consultations that have taken place as the IMF continues its work on this process. Some of the important things that have happened are conversations that the very people at this table have been a part of. One of the very important pieces that have come out since the conversation was a paper that was authored by Lee Buchheit and others to my left, a paper for the Brookings Institution in terms of looking at aspects of the process and how it might move forward. Another organization, the Canadian Institute for Governance Innovation, has also put out its idea, which has actively been discussed among the executive directors of the International Monetary Fund, of a sovereign debt forum. So we're brought here today in this moment as the IMF continues to explore this issue, the G20 continues to debate it, and fundamentally we're dealing with one of the root causes of the international financial crisis, a crisis that has moved millions and millions, more than 70 million people, into extreme poverty around our world. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Before I read Adrian Cosentino's introduction, to say a little bit about the format for today. Each of the speakers will be speaking for about 8 to 10 minutes apiece, and we plan to have over a half an hour of conversation at the end so that we can engage. Our first speaker will be Adrian Cosentino, the head of the Debt Restructuring Unit, the Ministry of Economy and Public Finance of Argentina, and the former Argentine finance minister. He will be speaking specifically about debt sustainability and looking at it in terms of sustainable development and speaking out of the history of Argentina. We will then hear from Aldo Cagliari, who's the director of the Rethinking Bretton Woods project of the Center of Concern, to discuss definitions of debt sustainability. Aldo is also on the board of Jubilee USA and has been looking at these issues in a framework that we'll release jointly in a paper later in the year. But it'll be looking at how do we more precisely look at the issues of debt sustainability, and then also, how do the questions of arbitration and others fit into this. We'll then hear from Christine Rainbin from Jubilee, Germany, who's done an analysis about where the trouble spots are around indebtedness around the world right now. And then we'll hear from our final formal speaker, Lee Buchheit, who's a partner at Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton, and has represented many of the sovereign countries through these processes and has a very specific experience that I think is helpful for this conversation. We'll then get formal responses from Timothy Antoine, who's the Grenadian Minister of Finance. Right now, they are in the midst of debt restructuring, so they also have some very powerful things to share about that experience. And then a response from Marco Cavalieri, who's the advisor, the executive director of the International Monetary Fund for Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyz Republic, Poland, Serbia, Switzerland, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. Then we'll open it up for conversation. So we're really excited to have this panel here with us who can speak to these issues from all of the angles that need to be brought up. And we'll start with Adrian Cosentino.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for this invitation. Jubilee has supported the position of Argentina for so long, so for me it's an honor to be here and to have the possibility of sharing with you.
People are having a little hard time hearing. I don't know if you can speak louder.
Louder, okay. Now? So I was saying that basically in these 10 minutes, what I would like to do is to share with you some comments regarding our process. And so when we talk about debt sustainability, and in the case of Argentina, I think that it's useful to differentiate what happened before and after the default. Before the default, because during the 90s, basically our sovereign debt dynamics and the important growth which ended up in the default event basically was explained by unsustainable macroeconomic policies. I like to point out this because sometimes the focus of sustainability has to do with technicalities, with macroeconomic issues, and we forget that always the macroeconomics is the key component when we have a debt sustainability problems. And in the case of Argentina, again, I mean, basically the macroeconomic dynamics during the 90s defined that the government was not able to continue paying its debt in 2001. So with the new chapter arising from the default, the definition of a new macroeconomic program under a totally different approach, we had the challenge of working in parallel with the debt restructuring plus the challenge of defining macroeconomic, sustainable, long-term conditions in order to make the debt restructuring sustainable, in order to be able to offer something to the investors that could be understood as fair, that could be understood as the offer consistent with the intertemporal payment capacity, that at the end of the day is the idea surrounding, I mean, sustainability. How a country will be able to pay and how the offer in a restructuring should be designed in terms of the securities, the transactions. I say the transactions because in our case, and maybe in some other experiences, when we talk about debt restructuring, we should understand more as a process than in a particular transaction. In the case of Argentina, we completed 2 successfully swaps where, I mean, we were able to restructure more than 92% of the total debt. Okay? From prioritizing this concept of sustainability, which demanded to define a macroeconomic model to assess the resources that the country will be able to transfer in terms of debt services, and then following the general legal principles. What I mean with this is working in a smooth, voluntary way with the investors, but being conscious, being aware of this idea that makes sense to make an offer if you know that your intertemporal macroeconomic conditions will allow you to pay what you are committing to do. And this was the sequence that we defined, even when at that moment we received a lot of critics because the haircut that Argentina put on the table was understood as aggressive, the securities were not well valued. Argentina incorporated in its offer an unconventional security, a GDP unit. Philosophically, we said from the beginning, okay, let's share, I mean, the challenge of growing, let's share the challenging of consolidating our macroeconomic conditions, and so if we are able to pay more, we'll do it, and this is the rationale of this security. And in fact, I mean, if this were a private transaction completing 92%, we would say that Argentina was able to finish the chapter of its sovereign restructuring. But we are talking about sovereigns. We are talking about a situation where the lack of an international bankruptcy framework makes this process very difficult, or even worse, impossible to complete. And this is maybe one of the main messages of our story, our ongoing story, because after succeeding in, again, what we call a very difficult, with a lot of work, with a lot of effort, working in parallel, in consolidating the macroeconomic situations, putting as a priority the sustainability, doing what we had to do, Argentina still have, a group of holdouts, 6 billion, when compared to the uneligible amount of $82 billion, the largest default at that moment. And we had to continue dealing in the legal field. And we have to continue dealing with, innovations that basically come up from the holes of this legal system. Now, for sure, you know about this novel interpretation of the pari passu clause and what it implies, and the potential connotations that can go beyond our battle, can go beyond Argentina and the litigator, connotations that have to do with systemic risk, connotations that can affect not only the future functioning of the bond markets, but even worse, the possibility for other sovereigns to complete what many times is necessary for macroeconomic reasons, that is to restructure its sovereign debt. And so right now we are in the middle of a battle with, again, fulfilling all the legal instances now at the Supreme Court of the United States, with the support of many players. For sure, you may know that at this instance, many amicus briefs were on the table, and I'm talking not only about specific institutions as the wonderful amicus of Jubilee, but also countries and academics and some representatives of the civil society. Why? Because this case for sure represents a lot of concern for the community, for other sovereign holders, in the idea that this Second Circuit's decision is implementing, for sure this will be very, very negative. So while we continue with this legal battle, again, we understand that it's very important in this kind of discussions to go back to some basic concepts. The topic here is sustainability, so we will say, in our case, Argentina was really very successful in advancing in parallel with the debt restructuring and consolidating a macroeconomic program where the concept of sustainability was defined in systemic terms by incorporating inclusion, by incorporating the priority of enhancing what we call the main macroeconomic fundamentals, fiscal solvency, external sector intertemporal, healthy conditions, and some other issues that make a development process sustainable, but also, with the possibility of optimizing the spillover effects that make sense in this situation. So, concluding, because I think my 10 minutes, I would say, following a phrase defined by Professor Stiglitz in his amicus, it's hard to conceive of modern capitalism without bankruptcy laws. Much more difficult is to conceive a sovereign debt market without clear and fair rules. And we know that sovereign restructurings are in many cases a necessary condition for reestablishing macroeconomics, good environments, for reestablishing what a country needs in terms of sustaining inclusive growth. In the case of Argentina, again, with a lot of efforts, we understand that we did everything when I say that we did everything following the rules, the principles, the practices, and we had to deal with this legal situation basically explained by the lack of mechanisms that allow countries to impose the minority when you get, a great level of acceptance, as it happens with the private sector. So, just for ending and open for questions, I would say that the only way is to continue doing what we've been doing with institutions as Jubilee, with sovereign partners, with some, supranational players. We have to continue working in defining not only ideas but concrete solutions that enhance the framework to avoid or at least to mitigate these unfair situations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for leading us off and defining what some of the problem is. Our next speaker will be Aldo Cagliari, who's the director of the Rethinking Bretton Woods project at the Center of Concern. And he's actually going to bring up and share with us what are perhaps better indicators and better ways of being able to define the debt issues and ultimately the debt crisis. So, Aldo.
Thank you, Eric. I changed slightly the approach I was going to take and focus instead of focusing so much on indicators, focusing on some of the preconditions to actually be able to define that sustainability in a way that because I was reading the actual question in the program, which is the how to get timely and sufficient debt relief, and so. One would think normally that, okay, you have the question of when debt becomes unsustainable, and then you think about the mechanism for restructuring the debt so it becomes sustainable again. And one would think that those things go in that chronological sequence, and that may be right chronologically, but in a more logical and practical sense, actually, what happens in reality is that the mechanisms that one has available for restructuring debt will determine to a great extent whether you can and to what extent you can make that sustainable again. And the definition of that sustainability is influenced by that availability or lack of availability of appropriate mechanisms. So I wanted to address the question more from that perspective of, when you look at, for example, how you deliver timely debt relief, and I'm talking about timeliness and sufficiency, and the program talks about that because that's like the counter, the other side of, or the opposite of what the IMF has said in its paper of last April is the feature of the current system, where debt relief tends to be too little, too late. So it's not timely, it's not sufficient.
I can't find a network connection.
So if you need it to be timely, first of all. And I'm going to come back to explain at the end how this affects the conclusions reached by the IMF. If you want debt relief to be timely, the thing you need to have in place is a restructuring mechanism that's going to make it relatively easy for the debtor to trigger it. And this is very important, and there is a lot of evidence that when the debt restructuring mechanism that's available is going to make it too cumbersome to actually restructure the debt, most likely the debtors will not use it and will delay the decision to restructure. And in that time when there is a delay, two very important things happen. The first thing is that there is a lot of unnecessary cost imposed on the population, because you could actually have a swift restructuring and have a lot less cost for the population and for the creditors also, by the way. So there is a situation in which the crisis sort of lingers on unnecessarily that could be avoided if the mechanism was easy enough to utilize. And the other thing that happens is that a lot of private lending actually withdraws from the country and is replaced by public lending. And we could very graphically see that in the case of Greece, where there was no private exposure when the crisis started in 2010. and then no public exposure when the crisis started. And then you have, like, at the current moment, like 80% of the exposure is from the public sector. This is something that touches very deeply things that in Jubilee we are promoting, because we are promoting responsible and accountable use of public resources. And we do not want to see public taxpayer-funded institutional flows of funds going to bail out private sector creditors that are in a very unaccountable way, just free riding on that for their own advantage. So these two things happen when you don't have a mechanism that is enough. Now, of course, you don't want to have a debt restructuring system that's going to make it so easy for the debtor to restructure that any debtor at any time just goes and uses it, right? So that's, you don't want to invite moral hazard on the side of the debtor. And I think those two considerations are the ones that will determine what is an optimally good debt restructuring system. You want to avoid moral hazard on the side of the debtor, but you also want to avoid moral hazard on the side of the creditor. So you want to make it possible for the debtor to restructure the debt in a form that is going to be timely. Now, if you look at the current system and you try to gauge how within that range of too friendly to the, I'm sorry, if it's too leaning towards making too much towards the side of moral hazard for the creditor or moral hazard for the debtor, I would say that it is a system that really encourages a lot more moral hazard from the creditor, because it is a system that makes it very difficult for the debtor to restructure, and it makes it very difficult for the debtor to restructure in a timely way. It makes it so difficult because it falls upon the debtor, because of the lack of a bankruptcy framework, as Mr. Cosentino had mentioned. It's actually up to the debtor to have to go after each creditor and settle with each creditor, and there is nothing other than the voluntary agreement of the creditor to exchange, or in the best case, some collective action clause that may allow you to only depend on 75% or some percentage of the creditors for reaching an agreement, rather than the whole set of creditors. But there is no other principle. It's really, you have to negotiate creditor by creditor, and this is an unacceptable cost imposed on the debtor. So sometimes you hear this expression that, oh, why do we need the restructuring systems if the ones that are there now are allowing the debtors to restructure? And people talk about the Paris Club and so on and so forth. But then at the cost of whom, at whose expense are these restructurings happening, and are they really timely? And I think we are very lucky to have here a very specialized audience, so perhaps there is nobody naive enough in this audience to believe that when you go to the Paris Club you only talk about debt relief. But for anybody left in the audience who may think that, the number of issues that you may have to discuss when you go as a debtor to restructure your debt to the Paris Club range from whether you will allow a certain creditor to establish a military base in your country, to whether you have settled a certain investment-related dispute with an investor from a particular creditor country, to the issues of whether you will allow or not access to a certain resource for a creditor from a particular country. There are many bilateral issues that are settled as part of the process of obtaining relief. So this is part of what makes it so difficult. It's not a process where there are rules. The rules are so vaguely defined that there is a lot of space for maneuvering and for acceding or not to restructure a certain debt according to political convenience. So Myanmar, for example, was a recent case of successful quote-unquote debt restructuring in the Paris Club. Myanmar actually had the lucky situation going on that China is also trying to move into Myanmar, and so many of the creditors that are part of the Paris Club were worried that Myanmar was going to seek support from China rather than continue to be in good terms with the Western creditors. So they decided, we have to make it a good deal for Myanmar, and this was a lucky situation for Myanmar, but not many debtors find themselves in that situation where they are coveted by other potential creditors. So that about the timeliness. About the sufficiency, it's also very much determined by the type of sovereign debt restructuring mechanism you have in place. And there is, again, a lot of evidence, and this coming from studying the bankruptcy systems and bankruptcy frameworks, bankruptcy legislations. The more creditor-friendly that the system is, the more that it will tend to systematically underestimate the amount of debt relief required to get the debtor back on its feet, back in a situation where it can grow and where it can repay all creditors successfully. So, and the opposite is also true. So you need to actually have a system that is going to achieve some equilibrium between the debtor friendliness and creditor friendliness. And again, if you look at the current system, I would say if you try to gauge where it is along those two, within those two extremes, it's probably too creditor friendly, because the amounts of debt relief that are provided tend to be systematically undershoot what is required to get the countries to achieve successful restructurings. And I think this can be seen in the situation. I think Mr. Antoine is going to talk about the Caribbean countries, but Jamaica has had to restructure its debt twice in the last 4 years, and it's very often occurrence that countries have to go to the Paris Club under the current system several times to restructure their debts, which that is not really showing that the system is efficient. It is actually showing the opposite. It is inefficient. If you had an efficient system, countries would not need to go so often to the restructuring table. But if you don't do it right the first time, if you don't have a correlation of forces that's going to allow you to achieve enough debt restructuring that the country can be back on its feet, then you will need to go back to the restructuring table sooner rather than later. And this is what is happening. We have also seen that, by the way, with Jubilee in the case of the HIPC countries, and the way that the sustainability was defined in 2005. Many of us have read those IDA papers when the discussions were taking place at the time, when the creditors were saying, well, even though for the HIPC countries the debt was being brought down to something like 50% debt to exports, and this was considered that going above that would be unsustainable. There was also a discussion of, okay, if we actually apply this to all the countries and we say this is more or less the level at which debt is going to be unsustainable, starts to become unsustainable, we are actually going to have to increase the amount of grants that are provided to these countries. So we cannot do that. Therefore, we will say that that is sustainable at a level where actually we might otherwise say it is unsustainable. We will actually understate overstate the sustainability of the debt. So these are two aspects in which the type of debt restructuring system you have in place are going to significantly condition what you can achieve in terms of whether it is timely or it is sufficient. And so this is our main problem with the IMF. Now people are beginning to call it the paragraph 32 proposal, because it is the paragraph of the paper in where it was addressed in the paper of April of last year, which actually calls for some mechanism whereby some form of bail-in of the creditors would be a condition for IMF assistance to countries that are in crisis. Why would that be a problem? Precisely because it's sort of like recreating the Paris Club, this time inside the IMF, because we do not believe that this will be actually an objective decision. The IMF is itself a creditor, and it's also governed by countries that are, and by the way, not governed in an equal weighted way by countries that are many of them also significant creditors, and where it is inevitable that there will be bilateral issues that will also need to come to the table. It's going to be difficult. It's going to depend on political decisions within the IMF. It's not going to be an objective way to achieve this, and it's not going to be it's not going to achieve this equilibrium that we are calling for, both in terms of the how easy or how hard it is, and in terms of how creditor friendly or how debtor friendly it is. It's not going to achieve the optimal equilibrium, precisely because the IMF is an institution that is a creditor. So we believe this will actually not address the too little too late problem that the IMF itself is saying that the current system is afflicted by. So with that, I end my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aldo. And I think it's also important to note and highlight that all of the speakers are going to have different opinions on each of these ideas, and I think it's going to be really important for us to be able to have a conversation that looks at some of the challenges that the commentators have made of one another. Our next speaker is Christina Rabin from Erlaser, or Jubilee, Germany. And she is going to actually do a global debt map to show us right now where the problems are and what we should be looking at in the months and years to come.
Thank you. We have already heard about Argentina, so I'm kind of giving a broader picture in terms of debt sustainability. I want to start with a sentence that demonstrates the underlying assumption of sovereign debt management for the last 30 years. I will just quickly read it. The initiative, meant is the multilateral debt relief scheme for heavily indebted poor countries. The HIPC initiative builds on instruments available to the international community to deal decisively with the debt problems of the low-income countries and allows them to exit once and for all from the rescheduling process. The underlying assumption here is that sovereign debtors actually do not go bankrupt, and that over-indebtedness is only a temporary, exceptional problem for a limited range of countries that can be overcome once and for all. In this case, there was the implicit belief that after debt relief under the HIPC initiative, there would be no sovereign debt crisis ever again, or any unsustainable debt situation that leads to sovereign debt crisis. Yes, that there would be. Yeah. Okay, at first sight, it may look like this indeed. What we see here are debt indicators from low-income countries. We see that debt relief has markedly reduced the debt burden of many of the countries that were qualified for the HIPC initiative. Also, we could observe strong economic growth, a surge in export earnings, and favorable world market commodity prices from beginning of 2000 until mid of 2000. However, the IFIs recently identified 6 post-HIPCs from 35 post-HIPCs that are at high risk of debt distress again today. That's the orange column. There are 16 of the remaining 29 post-HIPCs that go straight towards this risk level, being at a moderate risk of debt distress. So we see almost half of all post-HIPCs being in a more or less critical situation again. Thus, the assumption that over-indebtedness is only an exceptional problem proved wrong, but not just in 2014. As early as the end of 2008, that is, before the last country on the list would even have entered the HIPC initiative, 4 post-HIPCs have already been identified being at high risk of debt distress again by the IMF due to the financial crisis fallout. With regards to the debt sustainability of 75 low-income countries, the IMF found that 2 countries are in debt distress today, 13 countries at high risk of debt distress, and 28 countries at moderate risk of debt distress. Even though we do not see a lot of low-income countries in debt distress here, their current debt composition is significantly riskier than it used to be today, as there is less concessional funding available, and that comes increasingly from private sources, with higher interest rates and shorter maturities. Moreover, developing countries' fiscal buffers have been significantly used during the financial crisis to mitigate the crisis effects. So in case of a next economic crisis, there might be limited fiscal buffers to cope with the crisis. And let me just see. Sorry. Okay, sorry, I just need to. Okay, sorry. Last, however, NGOs also undertook research that was what Eric was mentioning before. We assessed debt sustainability of low and middle income countries from 139 countries. We have analyzed World Bank and IMF data on the basis of these 4 indicators. As there's not much time here, in case you're interested in the approach, in the detailed country data, I have some copies of this report here, so you can just pick it after the event and then check the approach. We have found that 62 of 139 low and middle income countries have one or more of their debt indicators above the debt sustainability threshold. 3 country groups can be observed. The first one contains vulnerable small island developing states. We have a representative here today who can speak a bit more about this country group. Just a few remarks on this group. They have some specific features such as small open economies that are especially exposed and vulnerable to external shocks such as natural catastrophes. You can see countries like Guyana or Sao Tome and Principe there. There were just 5 small developing island states that had access to the HIPC initiative. All the others were not considered to be poor enough. The second group are those countries I mentioned before that received debt relief under the HIPC initiative and the MDRE. And the third group are countries in Eastern and Central Europe as well as Central Asia whose economies have been liberalized in the 90s during their political transformation. With regards to the last group, especially the external debt to GDP indicator is almost consistently critical. This is mostly due to the high private sector indebtedness of these countries. Among these 62 countries, there are a large number of critically indebted middle-income countries whose populations still have a very high proportion of poor people. These countries never had access to debt relief schemes such as HIPC and MDRE just because they were not considered to be poor enough. Okay, the next one. Current debt vulnerabilities also include volatile capital flows. Middle-income countries were flooded with foreign capital when central banks in richer countries responded to the financial and European debt crisis with lax monetary policies. Now, investors expect the central bank in the United States to raise interest rates again. And several mixed middle-income countries such as Brazil, India, Indonesia, South Africa, they struggled throughout 2013 when capital flows reversed and flew back north. Currency crisis may follow from this, and this means that it's becoming more costly and thus less sustainable when debt is becoming sustainable when exchange rates fall. And then the second thing there is the time bomb contingent liabilities. Aldo has already spoken about Greece. You all may remember that excessive private debt triggered the crisis in Europe 6 years ago. For instance, the credit boom in Spain that fueled the real estate market bubble, or Ireland that had no sovereign debt problem at all, but then bailing out its banks during the financial crisis to support the banking system, which has cost 64 million euro, leaving the country with an unsustainable debt situation. So what is meant here with contingent liabilities is private sector debt that comes with an explicit or implicit government guarantee that could become public debt through bailouts. This comes with the real risk of a sovereign debt crisis when private debt turns into public debt, as we have seen in Ireland. Just a remark, prior to the severe third world debt crisis in the 1980s, there was also a boom in private lending to developing countries. And what we observe today is that in developing countries, private external debt has doubled, so it's steadily on the rise. Okay. So what's to be learned? Sovereign debtors do go bankrupt at all times. No sovereign debt crisis will ever be the last one in history. No country is immune, and a once and for all solution will never work, as debt cannot be made sustainable once and for all. Well, Aldo has spoken a lot about the inefficiencies of the current system. What we have seen before, that countries can go bankrupt at all times, and that this is nothing exceptional. This is not acknowledged by the current international system. The reliance on the assumption that sovereigns will always be able to pay up, and that in the unexpected case of failure, the crisis would be financed rather than solved, as happened in Greece. And as could be observed in the 1980s as well, has led to protracted crises, which ultimately have been costly for debtors as well as for investors, especially good faith investors. There are still not many options for a next country being in default to make the unsustainable debt situation sustainable again. We have heard a lot from Aldo about this. There's the HIPIC and the MDRI, but they are almost completed, and they were designed as a one-off exercise. So, well, it's actually done. There's no debt relief scheme at the moment. Well, in only limited countries, a limited amount of countries had access anyway. And then there are fragmented creditor clubs, but there's no comprehensive system dealing with defaults of sovereign debtors. So for us, from a civil society perspective, these are the three minimum principles, baseline principles, that well, need to guide any approach with regards to debt sustainability. That there needs to be comprehensive treatment, that all claims of a debtor need to be dealt with in one single process, not in fragmented creditor clubs, that the assessment of the debtor's fiscal and economic situation needs to be by an independent body, and that decision-making in the end also needs to be independent. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Our last speaker, before we hear responses from Minister Timothy Antoine and Marco Cavalier, is Lee Buchheit, who's the partner, who is a partner at Cleary Gottlieb Steen and Hamilton. He will be speaking overall about the issues of the fragility right now and the access that countries have to credit. We're really honored to have Lee here as one of our speakers. I was with one of his colleagues a few weeks ago who said, if you want two people of different minds to come together, you want to have Lee at the table. So Lee, since you're at the table, I'd like you to bring us all together.
Because I bang heads. I bang heads. Friends, thank you, Eric. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm going to offer you a simple observation, but it came to me rather late in life. Once upon a time, the phrase sustainable debt for a sovereign connoted the idea that the sovereign would generate sufficient revenues over time to service its debts as they fall due. It doesn't mean that anymore. Somehow, insensibly, it has been warped into a meaning which says that a sustainable sovereign debt is one which, when it falls due, the sovereign will have access to the markets to refinance it. Now, this is a crucial distinction. Market access can be lost, to be sure, in circumstances where the sovereign has pursued imprudent macroeconomic policies, but it can also be lost for reasons that are not involving any culpability of the sovereign. It can be an external shock. Grenada, 2004, Hurricane Ivan, an excellent example. In the space of 3 hours, the country's debt became unsustainable. Market access can be lost because something has gone wrong somewhere else in the world that has nothing to do with either your country or even your region, but which has made the markets skittish and has had the effect of turning them arthritic. They no longer want to lend to anyone who's an emerging market simply because they've had their fingers burned someplace else. It can even, market access can even be lost because something's going on in the developed world, such as rising interest rates, which lead investors to conclude that they can earn an honorable return on their investment in less risky situations. You remember 1994, when the Fed raised interest rates in this country 11 times in 12 months, result, tequila crisis in Mexico, starting in December of 1994. In a healthy market, in a healthy financial system, fear is the thing that keeps creditors, or is the thing that drives creditor prudence. They fear losing their money, and so they don't lend it quite as readily. The problem is that, as we've seen in the last 5 years, at a time of virtually zero interest rates, the hunger for yield operates in creditors like a disease of the autoimmune system. It suppresses caution. And any banker worth his or her salt can rationalize a decision to lend a couple of $100 million to a bucket of steam at a time when they're desperately in search of yield. So if the normal market caution is misfiring, the only break on excessive sovereign borrowing comes from the debtors themselves, and their, friends, is an equal problem. Borrowing money is basically a pleasant experience for a politician. The unpleasant part is repaying it. And if money is being offered, particularly at interest rates that are not remotely commensurate with the underlying risk, every atom of the political flesh will be to borrow it, because it allows not just projects, it allows budget deficits to be covered without the disagreeable actions of raising taxes or cutting services and so forth. Every atom of the political flesh will want to do it. But when that debt falls due, if the country does not have ready access to the market, it is a catastrophe. A country that accesses the market because it wants to finance a project, let's say, and finds that market access has been denied, that's an inconvenience. A country that must access the market in order to refinance a maturing debt, that's a catastrophe. The choices are really fairly limited, and all of them grisly. The normal reaction is desperate borrowings. You'll pay anything. You'll pledge anything in order to raise the money. That's almost always ruinous in the short term and certainly in the long term. If you can't do that, you can turn to the official sector and hope that the official sector will be prepared essentially to bail you out. That is, to lend to you, and our colleagues have mentioned this several times already this afternoon, will lend to you the money that you need to repay in full your existing creditors. That just shifts, that doesn't make the debt go away, it just shifts it from the shoulders of the private sector to the shoulders of the official sector. And of course we've seen that in Europe. We are seeing it now in the Ukraine. It happens, but I'm not sure it happens all the time going forward. The official sector simply does not have the resources to be the implicit guarantor of every sovereign debt instrument on this planet. And that would be the rational extension of the policy that has been pursued in Europe, with the one exception of the Greek restructuring in 2012. So the final consequence is default. Sovereign debt crises never come in isolation. They almost always come with a political crisis, with a broader economic crisis, with a banking crisis, with a social crisis. The source for so much of the enmity that many people on this planet bestow on sovereign borrowing comes from the simple fact that during the happy days of the borrowing, not much of that will trickle down to the average person on the street. But when the debt restructuring starts, that hits the average guy on the street directly, because of course austerity programs come in, and that is the source of much of the animosity that many people feel. We are, I think, in some danger of having a global financial system that enshrines a kind of financial bulimia, where in the happy days where creditors are prepared to lend at tolerably low interest rates, unlimited amounts of money. Politicians bulk up on that and assume that when those debts come due, there'll be some massive disgorgement, some catharsis called a debt restructuring that will liberate the country. And this goes on, as our colleague has said, this can be repeated for countries again and again and again and again. It is an unhealthy system. Here's an idea for you. You should have a little video of what a sovereign debt restructuring looks like, just how painful it is. And you should show that to politicians when they take office, because even if they're not in office when they've got to go through that process, somebody will be. In the absence, I no longer have any confidence that the markets will exert the kind of restraint that would keep this bulimia from being perpetuated. One has to look, I think, at the sovereign debtors and in some fashion engender a degree of caution. I remember, I think it was Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, who said, looking out at his battlefield victory at Fredericksburg, said to one of his generals, "It is good that war is so terrible, otherwise we should grow too fond of it. Politicians need to know that the debt restructuring is so terrible that excessive and easy and unjustified borrowing at the beginning is a grave disservice to the country."
Thank you, Lee. And that's a very strong segue into our first respondent. We're incredibly pleased to have Timothy Antoine, who is the permanent secretary of the Grenada Ministry of Finance, with us today. And the country of Grenada right now is in the actual midst of debt restructuring. So it's a very important response, and I think it also has the ability to bring us really to where the conversation is at right now and taking place. Over the past year, Jubilee Germany and Jubilee USA have worked with the Jubilee Grenada Committee and have tried to work and support this debt restructuring process. So I turn it over to Timothy. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Eric. And good afternoon to all friends of Grenada and friends of the search. Some of you have been on this sojourn for a while, and you perhaps could be called a faithful few. I don't know how to come after Lee, because Lee has shared some real pearls of wisdom with us this afternoon. He's somebody who's seen a lot of this action over the last, I don't know, too long. But let me be very brief. First of all, so thank you for having a small country have a voice in this discussion. We've had Argentina, and I suppose it's good that we have a small state. So I come from the Caribbean, Grenada, where 14 of the top 30 most indebted economies exist. All right? 14 of the top 30 most indebted emerging economies are in the Caribbean. Now, it is fashionable to say the country simply borrowed too much and they were profligate and all those sorts of things. The reality is, while I will not vouch for any politician, and I'm not one myself, just to be clear, the reality is that there's some objective criteria or conditions that have affected the region, including the fact that natural disasters, some of you are aware of that, major one every 2 years generally in the Caribbean. Grenada, of course, in 2004, others since then. The loss of preferential access for bananas and sugar in Europe, the loss of geopolitical interest in our region post the Cold War, which meant that we got less concessionary financing, hence more reliance on commercial borrowing, hence a shift in our composition of debt to more private credit, and a couple other factors. So one has to make sure one understands the picture, because I've seen these very uninformed analyses. Well, they can't be analysis because they're not near the facts, but uninformed positions which clearly do not reflect any understanding of the reality of the region. That said, we are where we are, and therefore I want to move to talk about three things very briefly. So much has been said, much of which I can agree with, that I feel that perhaps I just need to say three things and stop. The first is to agree with those who've come before me that we absolutely do need a sovereign debt restructuring or resolution mechanism. It is essential. The absence of that is what has caused us to continue to have, in the IMF's own words, based on this paper last year, restructurings that is too late, too little, too costly, too long, and too frequent. None of these things make sense for any one of us. And as Lee just pointed out, they are extremely costly across the spectrum. So I want to fully agree with those who have raised this point before, to say as a small state coming from the Caribbean, we absolutely feel that is essential. Absent that, we are facing the market, we are facing the vulture funds, we are facing creditors on our own, well, with a few friends like Jubilee of late, but in a very difficult place. And therefore, what has happened over time is a tendency for more market-friendly settlements, restructurings, which basically means we've kicked the can down the road. So we're going to come again, and then they talk about these serial defaulters. If you look in the Caribbean, in the OECS, the ECCU, in the last 5-6 years, we've had, well, let's say 9 years, because Grenada this is our second time in 9 years, and I'll explain a little bit about that briefly. We've had 4 countries, St. Kitts, Antigua and Barbuda, Grenada, and Dominica. Further afield, we've had Jamaica twice in 4 years, and we've had Belize twice in maybe 7 years. So the issue of the real risk of this serial defaulting and serial restructuring is very much in play when you have the kind of the absence of this effective mechanism. So I want to fully endorse that, and that's my first major comment, which is on the resolution side. Now, 2 points on prevention. And Lee touched on the fact that some countries have borrowed too much, and I accept that. And I think if we're going to resolve this issue, we have to have a fair discussion, an honest discussion about mutual accountability. And so, all countries need to understand what is their genuine capacity. In Grenada, for example, we're having this discussion. The norm is 60% of GDP in terms of sustainability, although Lee gave a very interesting view on what sustainability means or has evolved to mean. But for small countries like us, which has very limited access to the markets, we have to look at our ability to repay our revenues. And there is a view that while 60% is the norm, perhaps we should be looking at 40%. That has come out in the discussions we've had with Jubilee, US and Germany, in the discussions in Grenada in the last year. Finding an appropriate level for sustainable debt. Because very importantly, once we restructure, we need to find a mechanism to ensure we protect those gains. In other words, we do not have a situation where things are normalized, maybe limited access to the markets, and there is borrowing and overborrowing, such that we find ourselves back in the same position. And that's on the countries to play a role with our international partners. So they must work with us to make sure that we get it right, but clearly the countries have a big responsibility in that regard. So whereas with the sovereign restructuring, the fund has to play a lead role with other partners, the multilaterals. On the second point of prevention, the countries must lead with support from the partners. And final comment is the necessity to minimize shocks. In Grenada, we've had 2 shocks. In 2004, we had Hurricane Ivan, 200% of GDP. 3 hours, as Lee said, we were wiped out. Then, 4 years later, 5 years later, the global crisis, which we're still recovering from. So that was an economic hurricane. The first was a natural disaster. The second was a man-made disaster on account of what happened in the global markets. The fact is that global recession has hit the region extremely hard, and we are yet to fully recover from that. So that the loss of output now, since 2009, is bigger than even what we had in Ivan, in terms of the loss of GDP if you look year on year. So it's been enormous, and we found it very difficult to recover from that. As innocent bystanders, a crisis not of our own making, we found ourselves having to restructure a second time in 9 years. My point is, part of aiming for and securing sustainability requires a certain amount of action, collective action at the international level, that allows us to ensure that we minimize the risk of those kinds of shocks which could put economies in tailspin, such as those in the Caribbean. Not of our own choosing or making, but because we happen to be in a global economy that's increasingly integrated. And you pointed out other bigger economies that have been affected, and you made the point that no one is immune. So if the big ones are not immune, what happens to the small ones? Absolutely decimated. And so my final comment really is the need for us to find a mechanism to reduce that kind of risk to the international financial system, as we had in 2008, 7, 8, and for us in the Caribbean, we still have it, so that we do not have to get back into sovereign restructuring. So let me conclude then by simply saying that for us, there are 3 things that I think we can do to change the situation. One, to push for an effective sovereign debt resolution mechanism, and I agree with the comments that have been made on how we could get there. The fund has started a conversation. We need to get it to a point of real fruition and something concrete. Secondly, the countries themselves must ensure that we have sustainable debt by looking at perhaps fiscal responsibility frameworks. Now, I know there are mixed views on that. Some have worked, some have not worked. The idea of targeting fiscal rules in law, but clearly I think that is something certainly Grenada is looking at right now, and we would want to be able to understand that and make sure that it can work in the enterprise of getting to a sustainable external debt. And finally, minimizing the risk of disruption in an international financial system that puts countries like the Caribbean, Grenada included, basically at the mercy of the international markets and the vagaries of the external global economy. With that, I'd just like to thank you again for having me. I want to especially recognize the support we've had from Jubilee, Germany, Grenada, USA, and of course Grenada. And to say to you, those of you who've been on this sojourn for very long, we must keep up the fight, don't give up, because it's an important fight and the costs are simply too great for us to ignore. So thanks again for having us.
Thank you very much, Timothy. And our final respondent, before we open it up for a conversation, is Marco Cavalieri, who is the advisor to the IMF Executive Director for Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyz Republic, Poland, Serbia, Switzerland, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. Thank you for being with us today.
So, thanks, Eric. I would like to talk a little bit about the Swiss view on debt restructuring. So, first of all, I think, so the first thing is try to get the context. What is the big picture? The big picture is that we have the international financial architecture, and we have important gaps which have to be addressed. So one gap is the too big to fail problem in the banking sector. So we need comprehensive legislation. We need that this legislation is implemented. Another problem is the resolution of systemically important financial institution. So we need to have this cross-border dimension, which is mutual coordination of resolution plans. And then, as a third element, we have debt restructure. So this is the big context. So we're talking about the international financial architecture, and we need to work on different areas to have a architecture which is better and which can function more effectively. So coming to the sovereign debt restructuring. So my authorities, so the Swiss authorities, have been historically very supportive of the need of having a procedure for insolvency procedure for states. I would like to say that we were a strong advocate for the SDRM, so the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism of the IMF. We all know what happened, so there was not enough consensus. What we tried to do is, after that, we tried to push and then promote, say, the benefits of having work on sovereign debt restructuring about a mechanism in different international financial bodies. What I should say also is that we have been mandated by our parliament to come up with a proposal for a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. So our parliament is always very active, and we get this official mandate. So what I would like to, my contribution would be I think there is a broad agreement that we need to address this issue. So we have countries like Argentina, G20 country, we have small countries, so it's not something that it's does not occur. So it's something that might occur to everybody. So we need to really do something. The question is, what could we do now? How can we make a step forward? So I think that here there are two questions we need to answer. The first one is, what do we need? So what is really needed? That's the first question. Second question is how we get there. So define the goal, and then what kind of framework we could use to get this goal. So on the first question, well, what is the starting point? The starting point is the current debt for debt restructuring, which remains informal, which remains based on voluntary ad hoc solutions, and this is really not satisfactory. So you explain the problems. You also explain the problems. We have it's costly. We have uncertainty. It takes too much time. It's not effective. It's not clear about what is the risk for sovereign debt. So it's really not satisfactory, and we need to do something. What could we do here? I think that we need to have something which is international coordinated, and we need to have rules, and these rules have to be clear. And having these rules would be the way to have a debt restructuring which could be which could work in an orderly way. This is really the key goal. I'd like to emphasize 2 points in this respect. So we are not saying that we need that the goal is to make debt restructuring more attractive or more likely. This is not the goal. The goal is to be prepared for extreme situations like the situation that you mentioned. So this kind of extreme event, like tail events, where there is no other possibility that having a debt restructuring to reduce the debt. So we need to be prepared for this kind of situation and have everything in place that can help address these problems. The second observation is that so we are talking about music for the future. So we need to have something which maybe that will avoid to have again the problem that, for instance, Argentina had. So we need to have a plan. We need to have a strategy on that. This is very important. So this was the first thing. On the second point, so how do we get there? So I think we agree that we need these clear rules, there's some international coordination, and have this orderly restructuring process. But the question, how do we get there? So if we take the SDRM, so as I said before, the SDRM didn't get support. What was the problem of the SDRM? Maybe it was too ambitious. Because the idea was, while the IMF changes the Article of Agreement that requires 85% majority, that was difficult to achieve. We had important countries that did not support that because many reasons, I would say the fear of loss of sovereignty. So we need to be careful that we don't do the same mistake of being too ambitious, of coming with like SDRM version 2, which have no chance to gain enough support. So what could we do? What could we do now? I think we need to be realistic. We need to avoid doing the same mistake of being too ambitious. We need to have something which is feasible, something that reach support. So what I'm saying is that we need to be pragmatic here. So what does pragmatic, or what could be a pragmatic approach? Our view is that we could stay within a contractual approach and try to see how we can enhance this approach using elements of the SDRM. Like combine these elements and stick it in a framework that has more likelihood of gaining support. So we think that this is probably the most pragmatic way to achieve something and really have that restructuring mechanism which works. So what does it mean? Combining these elements? So one element that we could have is you mentioned the collective action clause. I think that this is so. If you take collective action clause alone, they are not enough to fix the problem. There might be a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. But these are collective action clause. But then you have the aggregation clause, which you can add to that. So if you combine these two elements, collective action clause and aggregation clause, then the situation is already different. So what we could have is have like a standardization of this clause, having them in the contract, the sovereign bond contract. So, by the way, so I'm not talking about exotic elements. So this is, if you take Argentina has these elements in the sovereign debt contracts. Uruguay has them. Dominican Republic has them. Greece has introduced this element. So the Eurozone have introduced these elements, collection clause with the aggregation clause, in all the sovereign debt which has been issued after January 1st, 2013. So we have that. So the question is to have it more standardized and to have a more widespread use. So this could be one element, work on that. The second element would be, okay, maybe to have these clauses effective, we need something else. Maybe what we need is to have you mentioned that, this arbitrating body. We need to have an independent arbitrating body that would do what? That would arbitrate between different creditors. So there is a problem, so this body would do this arbitrating function. It would coordinate the different claims, and this within a reasonable time frame, and then it would ensure a fair and adequate equal treatment. So we could have like a referral to an arbitration body settled by contract in advance. That would be an error. So we will have these clauses being effective. That could be a set. So the question is, the point here is to avoid having like different courts and different legislations which deal on that. So this complicates the situation. We need an independent arbitrating body that does it. There might be a third element which I would add. So like we could have like I would call it like a debt moratorium. So principle, the possibility of a stay of legal action, so to guarantee a debt moratorium. And so like having a standstill clause that, you know, ensure this stay of legal action. So concluding, I think that if there is a way to have a debt restructuring mechanism in place, is probably the one of staying within a contractual approach and try to enhance it in this way. So we are very glad that the IMF, after 8 years, started again the discussion. So the last one was 2005. We mentioned that 2013. It was really time. I would say that this is a very important topic because it's actually a core mandate of the IMF. So we have emphasized many times. So we hope that the IMF will continue. And there was some delay, so the paper was actually expected before Christmas. Now it has been postponed, and there will be something in June. And we expect that the IMF will come up with analysis on benefits of having an enhanced contractual approach. And yeah, this is I would say everything I wanted to say.
Mark, thank you very much. So we'd like to open it up for conversation right away, and we'll start off by taking 3 questions. If you can please introduce yourself and then concisely share your question, and then we'll open it up to the panel for responses. We might only have time for one group of questions. So one, who has the second question? Great, and 2, so we'll start off, please.
Yeah, hello, my name is David Schenzel. I'm an advisor to the German Executive Director in the IMF. My question would be to Timothy, if you could elaborate on what the concrete problems or challenges you face in dealing with the creditors of Grenada, and if I understand correctly, the Paris Club creditors, the non-Paris Club creditors, and the private sector.
Great, thanks. The second question?
I'd like to ask if there's any consideration at all in the context of Jubilee for complementary currencies that are supplements to sovereign currencies. A quick definition might be a credit instrument based on and accepted as credible by agreement for payment within a community. This is a societal community to voluntarily use a standard denominated in some unit of scale adopted by the users as a medium of exchange instead of or in combination with fiat currencies.
Great, thanks. And one more question? Do we have one more? Great, so
Maybe before the questions, I would like to make some comments regarding something that Marco mentioned, basically about cuts, okay?
sure. Well, then perhaps, and then we can just open it up for any responses from the panel as well. So those questions, and I think there are other comments or responses that panelists will have, but we'll take the first question and start with Minister Antoine.
It's PS, not minister.
Yeah.
A public servant, not a politician. But thanks for the question. Just to say, here's the composition of Grenada's debt. So we have 37% commercial, we have about 32% multilateral, IMF, World Bank, Caribbean Development Bank, be the main ones. We have 2% Paris Club. Then we have non-bilateral, non-Paris Club like Taiwan, and a couple others. So first of all, that's the picture in terms of our creditors. So the traditional way where we go to the Paris Club, or we simply have the conversation with multilaterals, would not apply here, does not suffice. We have to speak to all of these different groups who have different preferences, different demands. And all of that from a small country with a relatively small team. But they have the same expectations that I suspect they have from Greece or from wherever. So that the people in the Paris Club, even though only 2% of our debt is with the Paris Club, expect Grenada to be with them, treating with them, constantly engaging them. You know, some countries have a full-time international financial unit dealing with just Paris Club. We don't have that. We have a couple people having to deal with everybody. So therein lies the difficulty. So what we've had to do is to engage all of them, respond to all of their needs. Obviously, they all have common data needs, but beyond that, they want to have different types of discussions. Even though ultimately we have to get to a point where we have treatment that is equitable, you know, comparable. So just the logistics of coordinating what is a complex set of partners, where in this case the lead is actually the private creditors, is very different. And again, we would have benefited from some kind of organized independent mechanism rather than what we've had, where we've had to go to different people who expect to get our full attention all the time, but we have all these other players who also expect to get our attention, and it's been challenging. We've been a year at it now, and we obviously made a lot of progress, but it's taken quite a while because of the complexity involved.
Great. So now I'd just like to open it up to the entire panel to address either of the questions or to offer any responses. And actually, I'm just going to tap Lee first, because I know you may be leaving soon, and then turn it over to Adrian Costantino.
Well, I'll respond to our colleague's question about alternative currencies. We have some experience of that. Of course, Argentina had them back in 2001 and 2. Sorry, Argentina, some of the provinces of Argentina were issuing their own currencies. You remember Governor Schwarzenegger in California, in the face of a budget difficulty, issued IOUs. Interestingly, in this country during the Depression, there were many instances, Salt Lake City was one, where municipalities would issue their own currency, and as you say, by agreement, people would take it as a medium of exchange. Of course, it had a pretty clear geographical limit, but no, it certainly happens as an emergency measure. I remember in Mexico in 1981, when the banks essentially had shut down, people would write personal checks, so $100 to Eric, and then they would literally staple onto it a sheet, and people would endorse the check, and it would trade as a currency in the market as opposed to a $100 bill. So there are many examples.
Adrian.
In emergency situations, basically. When we talk about Argentina, this idea of what we call that quasi-currencies was basically the natural consequence of a very dramatic macroeconomic situation. We should think that once you advance in normalizing the macroeconomic situation, it makes sense that these things should be disappearing. But I would like to go back to something that Marco mentioned, and I'm worried about this idea that CACs could be a substitute in some way of having an international bankruptcy law, or at least mechanisms for allowing sovereigns to complete, its debt restructuring process. And why? I understand that CACs can help. I understand that is, a positive thing to include in the contracts, but don't forget, that we are thinking about something with concrete limitations, because always what it happens is that you have a stock of debt without this, so this situation at best should work for the future flow of debt. Secondly, the veto power by some creditors can be gotten in not an expensive way, okay? In some specific series, when the nominal amount is not high, could be not difficult to get the 25%. You also mentioned, Marco, the possibility of solving this problem with aggregation clauses, and obviously is a solution for this, but again, you can be dealing with the situation where, a holdout with financial capacity can again affect the possibility of getting the majority you need in order to complete. What I'm saying with this is, for sure, are initiatives that help in order to improve contracts, and in specific, events like the default and the necessity of advancing a restructuring, obviously, can be useful to have this in a contract, but for sure we should understand this as, a substitute of having what we've been discussing here, and I think that there was an important consensus regarding the lack of a framework and specific mechanisms that allow sovereigns to do what the private sector can do in this kind of situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any final comments? So Marco, and just want to check, are there any other panelists that will want to say
I'd like
anything?
to come back to it. So the question is whether there is a support for something like a SDRM version 2. And I don't know. I doubt that there are still, I don't know if certain countries are ready to have a discussion about that. So this is the big problem. I recognize that CACs are not, only CACs will not be enough to fix the problem, but you do have cases where CACs work. So if you take Greece, so in the case of Greek, so Greek was a bit special case because 90% of the debt was under Greek law.
Yeah.
What they did, they changed the law to introduce the CAC retroactively. So it was a bit of sort of ad hoc procedure, but the CACs worked there. So especially if you have the two things like the CACs with like 2/3 like every issue, and then the other one with 2/3, which is lower than 75%, and the other one, if you take the two, so it's more likely that you will have something. But again, it's talking about probably a second best, right?
For sure, and you give a good example regarding Greece, because even when CACs allow to advance in the restructuration, here we are also discussing fairness, no? And Greece has to pay full to some creditors because CACs, didn't work in some specific way. So if, again, we are incorporating the discussion sustainability plus fairness plus what we understand should be, a sustainable restructuring, Greece is an interesting case because
the key question is the interpretation of the pari passu clause,
yes.
Right? That's a key question.
Yes, for sure.
So we're going to close, but we will have a final comment from Aldo Cagliari and then Christina Rabin. So Christina will be our final comment, but before Christina speaks, we just really want to thank you on behalf of FES New York, Jubilee USA Network and Jubilee Germany for coming and being with us today. We want to let you know that an audio recording of this entire session will be available at jubileeusa.org. So we'll turn over to Christina for our final comment
I
today.
think it's a good concluding remark. You said, Marco, that any goal of a sort of debt restructuring mechanism should not be that there are more restructurings. Actually, defaults happen. It's just the question, do they happen disorderly or do they happen orderly? So a restructuring mechanism, in my opinion, would not increase defaults. They just happen. It just would make them more orderly. That's
Just
my
talking about
conclusion.
the incentives, not to send wrong incentives. That's what I mean.
Well, our panelists are in the front of the room. If you want to continue the conversation with us, we invite you to come up and meet us. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.